Hello, good evening. I'm Father Alexander, and welcome to St. Peter's Hove for our 60th step in our journey through the Bible. Now, we're in the middle of the book of Joshua, and we get to chapter 10, which is a longish chapter, which tells us about the conquest of the southern part of Palestine. Now, as you remember from the last episode, Joshua had made an unequal treaty with the Gibeonites. So 5 Amorite kings, and Amorite just means sort of Canaanite, the sort of people who lived in Palestine in those days. 5 Amorite kings form an alliance and immediately, for their own defense, and immediately decide to go and attack not Joshua, but Gibeon. Whereupon, when they're attacking Gibeon, Joshua does a night march, comes up behind them and attacks the 5 Amorite kings and their armies and destroys them. And this is helped by 2 events. One is a hailstorm, most unusual in those parts and most uncomfortable for an army, I should have thought. And also the sun stops and lasts all day. There's some sort of astral miracle which allows Joshua to fight, for 48 hours instead of 24. We don't need to take this astral miracle very seriously. It's probably a poetic device, although the writer of the book of Joshua clearly thinks it happened. But in fact, he's quoting an old poem about Joshua, which talks about the sun standing still over Gibeon. Anyway, the 5 kings then go off and hide in a cave. Then they're dragged out of their cave and executed. Then we're told that the 5 kings, they were given another passage in which the territories of the 5 kings are conquered yet again, and the kings are executed. So the kings, some of them seem to get executed twice. They're 2 different versions of what happens to the 5 Amorite kings. And then, of course, we're told, well, having done all that, Joshua has now made himself the master of southern Palestine in one campaign, and he goes back to his camp at Gilgal with his army. And of course, at this point, we ask ourselves, well, hang on, it doesn't say that Joshua has conquered Jerusalem. He's killed the king of Jerusalem, but he hasn't actually conquered Jerusalem. He's conquered a lot of cities, we're told, and yet not Jerusalem. So how could it be that he's conquered the whole of the south of Palestine? Well, we know that the person who conquered Jerusalem was King David, many hundreds of years after the time of Joshua. So what we're faced with here is that we're told Joshua conquered this, Joshua conquered that, and so on. But it ain't necessarily so, because the conquest didn't all happen at the time of Joshua. The conquest went on and was a process that took hundreds of years. In fact, the conquest was completed by King David. Because King David, don't forget, was the one who fought against Canaanites and fought against Philistines in particular, and fought against the Jebusites who occupied Jerusalem at that time. But this gives you the impression that Joshua carried all before him, and that these 5 kings were just wiped away by Joshua. Well, it's not really an historical account. That glaring what's the word I'm looking for? Lack of coherence about Jerusalem being a point in question. One thing that is probably clear, though, is that in those far-off days, the 13th century BC, there were small towns, and each small town had a king. And these kings ruled these towns and would have had an army, would have had a levy, but these kings would probably have had very few troops at their disposal. And these kings would not have been very grand figures. They would just have been single kings, a bit like a mayor of a town today. They wouldn't have been that very important. So Joshua is destroying the social system that is in Palestine at that time, small isolated kingdoms, and he's replacing it with what? Well, that's a bit worrying, isn't it? Because we're told about the Israelites are highly organized, but they're in a tribal sort of system. And then later on, as we'll see, the Israelites themselves develop their own kings. Now, the important thing about this is, if you look at, if you like, the punchline of the whole chapter is verse 14. There never was a day like that before or since, when the Lord obeyed the voice of a man, for the Lord was fighting for Israel. Joshua and all Israel with him then went back to the camp at Gilgal. And then we're told that again. All these kings and their territories Joshua captured in a single campaign, because the Lord, God of Israel, fought for Israel. And then Joshua and all Israel with him went back to the camp at Gilgal. So God is a partisan God who fights for Israel. And there are some, of course, who believe even today, particularly our evangelical fundamentalist Protestant brethren, that God fights for Israel. There is a chosen people and God fights for them. And if you're on the wrong side, God is fighting against you and you are fighting against God. I don't think any Catholic is going to believe this. And I don't think any Catholic should. The book of Joshua is a pretty the opposite of war weary, a pretty war enthusiastic book. And the book of Joshua does seem to say that God does join in these battles. So if you're a pacifist, the book of Joshua makes very depressing reading. Now, I'm not a pacifist. I've never been a pacifist. I do think there are certain wars that have to be fought, though I'm not a warmonger, and I'm certainly anti-war. Everybody who's got half a brain is anti-war. One of the things about this is all the women and children and so on being killed in all these towns. Nobody seems to care about that. So it makes you think about the victims of war. And does God really take sides in war? No, he doesn't, because God is justice, and justice is a universal virtue. Justice is the same in Gilgal as it is in Gibeon, as it is in Jerusalem. And justice is something we should all seek. And if we all seek justice, there would be no wars. Wars come from one group trying to impose something unjust on another group. So therefore, we must hold to justice and seek justice, and then war will disappear. However, we've got to accept that there are some very unjust people around, and they need to be resisted, if necessary with force, if necessary with lethal force, depending on the type of injustice they're trying to inflict on us. This is the just war theory, which was developed very early in Christian thinking. There are pacifist Christians, but Christianity itself is not a pacifist religion. And I think that is quite important that we grasp that. So we don't believe in a warmongering God, but at the same time, we're not pacifists. Was Joshua right to invade the Holy Land? Was Joshua right to invade Palestine and to dispossess its original inhabitants? I have to say, according to the standards of today and reading what we read, absolutely not. It seems a frightful injustice, barging into Palestine and killing the kings and driving everybody out, and of course killing all those who resist or stand in your path. It seems unbelievably awful. Much rather would be a pacific reading of the Bible, which says that all this is to some extent a fictionalized idea that God has given the land to the people of Israel, but the people of Israel acquired it by a gradual and much more peaceable infiltration. And indeed, it's probably best to understand the land, the Holy Land, not as a land that was 100% Israelite, but a land which was rather like an African country today. There were lots of different tribes living in the same land, more or less rubbing along together fairly well. And indeed, in the time of King David, there were Philistines, there were Israelites, and so on and so forth. Okay, and indeed, the Israelites themselves were 12 tribes. So there we are. We'll carry on with the book of Joshua in due course. All the very best. Bye.